to Sidekicks, the weekly cybersecurity podcast hosted by Richmond Advisory Group's principal analyst, namely me, Christina Richmond.
And me, Rory Duncan. This podcast is your go-to partner for understanding the cybersecurity market, industry trends, and the real-world challenges of protecting organizations today. Hello, Christina.
Hello. I still have Route 66 in my mind because today is episode 66.
It is.
So we could sing, "Get your kicks on, Sidekicks." I don't know, something like that. But we won't because
we will get copyright struck.
We might get thrown in prison.
And nobody will ever hear us,
Yeah, nobody will hear it. So do you know that was a song sung by the King Cole Trio? Did you know that?
No, I did not know that.
Indeed. The Nat King Cole and the King Cole Trio. Yeah.
Interesting. Well,
it was on the album After Midnight. Anyway.
Gosh, that's good. Go. Well, interesting. The way I know it is because there's a folk singer. Well, he's kind of a modern folk singer called Billy Bragg in the UK who did his own version of it, which was...
Did it have CyberSaint?
Well, it was on the A14. It was about where he comes from, which is Basildon in Essex, and it's basically about that particular route, which isn't as exotic as Route 66, but talks about Shoeburyness and all the towns along the way. So that's how I knew it. And I thought, this must be a cover version of something. So there you go.
Okay.
If anybody on listening to the podcast knows the said tune and knows who Billy Bragg is, please let us know and you get a special prize. Right, so what have we got on this week then?
Yeah, we have some good stuff this week. We have a series of specials that we're doing, and the specials it kicked off with the MDR market, kind of the current state and the outlook of the MDR market. Mm-hmm. And we also produced a couple of blogs from that had, dark horses in the MDR market. And I think that podcast and the blogs got better readership and listenership than some of the other things that we've done. So we thought, hey, folks, we think you want market overview information. We think, but this week will be a governance and compliance or governance risk and compliance market overview, a quick dash to the history and then current players. It will not feature the dark horses because there's too much consolidation happening, too much occurring to modernize GRC quite rapidly. Yeah. And there are a lot of startups. And I wouldn't want to call them necessarily the ones to bet on because they're so new. But also, I think there are some substantiated companies that need to be called out and also a few bridge companies that need to be called out, if you want to call them bridges to the future. And then maybe a couple newer ones, or at least one newer one that is, I think, interesting. We've talked to several times.
So who do we have as a guest on the show, or guests on the show today, Christina?
Ooh, yes. It's kind of a really action-packed episode. So we have Matt Alderman from CyberSaint. He's the Chief Product Officer. And then we have the fabulous Fabio Campos, who is the managing partner of the GRC practice, which they call Security Risk and Compliance Consulting over at IBM. And so it's going to be a lovely bookended conversation of these two companies, and they actually are partners in real life. So that'll be fun.
Yeah, that'll be great. So, Christina, let's talk about a market that has been around for a very long time, but feels like it's kind of entering a genuinely new phase. And we talked about it last year on the podcast quite a bit when, in fact, yes, we reflected on the fact that things were changing, things were accelerating in their change. And that is cyber risk, resilience, and GRC, or governance, risk, and compliance, but the cyber aspect of that. Now, in the notes we've pulled together, thank you for that, what makes it interesting is that these areas are starting to converge. IBM's recent move is a strong signal of that. They've done a lot of interesting things in that area. And companies like Safe, CyberSaint, Spectrum, and others each show a different part of where the market is headed. So, Christina, let's say as a veteran in the GRC space, it's true.
As an old person,
well, a grey beard in that space. What do you think? Is this a good summary of where we are for GRC?
Could you not comment on my grey beard? Because honestly, I do my best.
Okay.
Anyway, okay. Yeah, the easiest way to think about this market is to look back a bit. Mm-hmm. So I know a lot of our listeners will remember the days where if you were a large enterprise, you could hire, the big four, Deloitte, mm-hmm. PwC, KPMG, EY, maybe even Accenture, which was not really an accounting firm, but also did GRC. Yep. You could hire them. It was a very manual, spreadsheet-based, consultant-led engagement. And it was probably once a year, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. It was once a year because things didn't change quite as rapidly as they do now. So there'd be spreadsheets, interviews, policy binders, mm-hmm. point-in-time assessments that in today's world, those point-in-time assessments they'd be moot as soon as you walked out the door, right? Then what happened was the very manual labor-based spreadsheets became more automated. They were software assisted and they became, more data rich, like with companies like C1 Risk. It's a smaller company I've studied through the years. Lily Yo founded it. So women-owned, woman-run, really nice set of software to help you ingest all of your data. Great, terrific. So that was a step, and that was not creating, it would create your risk registry with you, but you still had to manually load everything. It helped, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. Then next, people wanted to know for their board and for their executives, well, how much will it cost me if I accept this risk and don't remediate the risk? How much will that cost me if there's a breach? And conversely, how much will it cost me to actually update my systems to remediate and not accept that risk, to fix that risk? How much is that going to cost me? Give me a comparable. And that became cyber risk quantification, or mm-hmm. now called CRQ. But now, Rory, this is what's exciting. And the latest announcement from IBM actually signals this to me. This market is becoming operationally intelligent, where AI can now, Gen AI and agentic AI, can help us connect posture, exploitability, policy, remediation, and resilience, which we should define. So we'll get to that. Mm-hmm. But it can do all of that in near real time, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah, and CRQ is an important one to remember later on because it will come up a number of times in this discussion. And I know you phrased that in terms of history, and that's important because, of course, now it would be quite easy to say, hey, everything is AI, right? So it didn't suddenly jump. It evolved in stages. So first off, it was about organizing information, then automating a workflow, then pulling in more data. And then the approach was to express cyber risk in business terms. But where we are now is that it's changed the link between knowing and acting, right? Knowing and acting.
Right. Yeah, exactly. GRC has been important. Regulatory controls have required us to comply. We needed to look at our risk and figure out what we were willing to accept. Governance, is part of the whole compliance regulatory conundrum, and how do you govern that and your internal environment to be compliant and to solve the risk problem. But everything was documenting reality rather than continuously understanding and improving the reality, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why so many teams then ended up with polished documentation, but there was a limited operational clarity. So right. I think to your point, you said a tidy risk register does not necessarily mean you are resilient in reality.
Exactly. I mean, woohoo, we have a spreadsheet. Woohoo, we have a report. but it didn't actually help us be resilient in real time. So now we're moving towards operational truth, more data, more signals, things have been coming in. And this is, probably where quant entered, that CRQ entered the picture, right? Mm-hmm. We're starting to translate things into business language. And this is where safe security, which we mentioned at the beginning, and CyberSaint start to become more important. They sit in that bridge layer between the technical cyber data and that executive decision making. Mm-hmm. They are trying to make risk more continuous, more intelligible, more intelligent, more actionable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but hold on a second though, because quantification can also become its own trap. So you can turn risk into a number if you quantify it, but you're still too far from the actual operating problem. You haven't really addressed it.
Yeah, you're always the devil's advocate. One could say a Debbie Downer, a Duncan Downer.
Duncan Downer. Yes.
It's instead of Dunkin' Donuts, it's now going to be Duncan Downer.
Oh dear.
No,
oh dear.
No, but
have I become a meme, Christina? Have I become a meme?
We're gonna spread it on the internet. No, but Rory, I agree. This is actually one of the big tensions in the market. You've called it out. Absolutely right. It's easy to confuse that one slice, that quantification, that CRQ, with the whole story, right? Vulnerability exposure is not the same thing as risk. They get conflated all the time, but it's not the same thing. A risk registry it's not the whole center of gravity, folks. And quantified loss is helpful, but it's not the final answer. I agree.
Yeah, exactly. Which brings us to the phrase which kind of best captures this, which is a la mode, which is operational intelligence.
A la mode. And we were talking about the slice of the pie. So a la mode is perfect. Yeah, the market's moving beyond just documenting risk, scoring risk, translating risk in isolation. It's now trying to connect posture, exploitability, policy, remediation, compliance, and then again, resilience in a continuous loop that influences outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned IBM before, and it's important to mention them again here because IBM is the signal, the kind of indication of where the market's going.
Yeah, with IBM, I would say what they are doing today and what they've just announced in April is a signal. Right? The April announcement matters because it shows this major incumbent that has done GRC for a long time. It's done risk quant. They are explicitly tying agentic security operations to governance and risk systems. What they're saying is that fragmented tools and manual processes are increasingly outmatched, especially in an era of agentic threats. Yeah. So the answer from IBM is coordinated. It's AI-driven security operations whose insights can feed directly into governance and risk.
Right. So it's goodbye, old GRC world, and hello to this continuous operating model.
Really what I'm thinking of is the direction of travel that we're going in. IBM is validating the direction that we are taking. I know it's a bit of a stretch. I'm sorry, but I had to tie them together. No. I think IBM validates where we're headed, right? It tells the market that the future is more continuous, more evidence-based, more connected across operations, governance, and resilience. And so read the press release, folks. Some of it was this week, some of it was last week. They announced autonomous security. They announced a cybersecurity assessment in the GRC space. And then this week they announced working with Azure policy and their agentic capabilities. So read those three things to kind of get a little bit of background on this.
Yeah. And you might have to read it several times. There's a lot in well, only because there's a lot in there, and it's quite detailed.
Yeah, same. And we'll put the links in the show notes, so that'll make it easier for folks.
Yeah. I think there was also a blog, I think. I took a glance at it. Yeah.
Yes.
So maybe I'll put that in the show notes as well, because the blog is more, I think it's easier to read than the press releases. But there we go.
I agree.
Which is fine.
I agree.
Let's have a look here. So we've talked about IBM being the signal or the bellwether, right? The next stage, who helps the buyers? So get from that old model to the new one, and this is why we're talking about Safe and CyberSaint. I think you've called them the bridge players, right?
Yeah. I mean, so here's the thing. There are gajillions, that's a technical term,
Yeah.
of players in this space. And they come at it, as we've said, from the vulnerability exposure side, from the asset inventory or CTEM, that continuous threat exposure management side, and the ASM side. They come at it from just doing risk registry and ingesting data and automating that data. They come at it from the risk quant side. There are so many players. So really what I wanted to focus in on, and not that these are the only two, and not even that I'm calling them best, but I do think that these are two very different, very interesting, potentially somewhat polar opposite, but also a little bit redundant to each other. And I'm calling them bridge players because I think their models are helping us move to the new way of doing GRC. So one is safe security, and the other one is CyberSaint. And it's just a great twist of luck or fate that we got to have Matt Alderman on.
So talk to me about SAFE then.
Yeah, I mean, SAFE is compelling because, okay, it's an older company. I think it was started in 2012. It's bigger than CyberSaint. It's well established, but it started in cyber risk quant.
Okay.
And it's clearly pushing towards something bigger. It's not just saying, here's your risk in financial terms. It's pushing towards more autonomous risk management across multiple domains. It wants to sit where your telemetry, your business context, your quant, and the action of all of that come together.
Okay, so back to the bridge analogy then. So SAFE is this bridge that goes from quantified cyber risk over to a more agentic operating model.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to put it. It is. I like that.
But CyberSaint is a bit different, though.
Yeah. So again, this is the opposite, but in some ways not redundant, but comparable is maybe a better word. CyberSaint is still grounded in cyber GRC, but it's modernizing that layer in a meaningful way. So it's focused on the continuous controls, monitoring, looking at agentic evidence collection, frameworks, prioritization, and financializing the cyber risk. So in some ways, it's similar, right, to SAFE. But it's also saying you don't need to throw out your cyber GRC, but you do need to make it more continuous, more automated, more tightly connected to the action.
So then the relationship with IBM is important there because then it gives CyberSaint's position a bit more weight. It reinforces the aspect of the story that it is part of a broader, or it can be part of a broader enterprise model. It's not just a standalone compliance solution like perhaps some others are.
Yeah. CyberSaint is newer. It's smaller than SAFE. It hasn't been around as long. It's more of a startup. And it's doing some things in fresh ways using the latest and greatest of AI. And I think SAFE is also pushing towards greater autonomy with AI capabilities as well. So, I mean, I think, again, comparable in some ways. But yes, that relationship between IBM and CyberSaint, that is definitely a key piece here. So I think the other thing that we need to talk about is Spectrum, right? Because that is very new.
Yeah, and we've talked about them a number of times before. They've come up regularly, haven't they?
Yeah, so it's Spectrum Labs, and it's Spectrum with a K. It's taking everything a step further. And this is where we start to talk about resilience. Potentially the broader definition of resilience in my mind. Resilience to me is not just that I know what my risk is and I'm working towards remediating all the risks that I don't accept and accepting those in a healthy, smart way that is in my risk registry that I've documented. No, what does it do operationally? What does that mean for me operationally when I understand where my vulnerabilities are, what's exposed, where my assets are, again, what's exposed? When I understand my industry, I understand my customer segment, I understand my regulatory controls and my compliance issues, if you will. And then I actually put some operational intelligence on top of that to say, I'm going to continuously look at each of those things. I'm going to use those to make sure that I am insured. So if you can't accept a risk, you might want to at least have money in your back pocket from an insurance provider, right? And so this is what Spectrum does. It brings in quote unquote proof, and they do this by checking your controls, checking your configuration of those controls, validating that those are controls that are properly configured, and then giving you a token that says, this is proper, yes, you're using this control. They also are looking at vulnerability and exposures. They are also looking at your entire asset inventory. And then they're serving it up in a continuous fashion using agentic tools behind the scenes.
Okay. So if we were to summarize it, the way we might do it would be to say, if IBM is the signal or the bellwether,
yes,
Safe and CyberSaint are these bridge players, slightly different bridges, but that's their function. And then Spectrum is the provability player.
I like that. That is awesome. A provability player. Yes, I like it.
Obviously, we're simplifying things slightly because there's many other adjacent vendors, and as we've seen and heard and had guests on talking about the different things that they do, many of them will look at niche aspects, so narrower parts of the problem, whether that's to do with exposure, software resilience on its own, or organizational readiness on its own. But the bigger story here is it shouldn't be about any one slice. This is all about the convergence of risk, governance, operations, and resilience into something more intelligent and more connected.
Yeah, so, buyers should ask, are you just helping me document, model, or are you trying to help me change my risk world or prove what I've done in the risk world, right? So what exactly are you giving me? They should be asking to each of their providers. How continuous is your system? What do I get to do with that output next? I mean, does everything just go to the dashboard to die? As it did very much so in the old days of GRC, where it was just a flat document or spreadsheet? Or does the information you're providing me influence action?
Yes. So on that basis, then, if we were to sum it up, I will attempt to sum it up. So we talked about history to begin with. So GRC and cyber risk management were mostly about the organization, so the organization and documentation, right? And that's where it kind of stopped, or at least it was focused. Then they became more data rich. Then they became more financially literate through quantification, put numbers against it. But now they're becoming operationally intelligent, where AI can tighten the link between risk insight and action. So the next frontier may be whether that intelligence, to where we are now, can produce verifiable proof of resilience.
Yeah, that is the story. So IBM, with their announcements last week and this week, is signaling the shift. Safe and CyberSaint are helping buyers cross into that. And the partnership between CyberSaint and IBM kind of stitches that together with IBM. But the next piece that I would like to see added to that story is what Spectrum is working to provide. And that is a proven outcome. But we've been tracking them for 4 years, and we've, looked at their code, been in GitHub, had demos of what they can do. So together, I think this story tells us that we have the potential for operational intelligence with proof. I think GRC is finally getting the facelift and the modernization that it has so needed for so long, Rory.
Yes.
And it's exciting. GRC has typically been a bit of a yawner market. Sorry, folks, for those of you who love it. And I do love it. I have a great deal of fondness in the 20 years I've studied it for how it is done and why it is required and what is needed. But now I do think that this operational intelligence, instead of just being another risk platform, is a much better way to frame it.
Yes. So this week's special guest is Matt Alderman, Chief Product Officer at CyberSaint. Hi, Matt. How are you doing? Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Rory and Christina.
Really, we're so excited to chat with you about GRC today and what you see in the market, what's changing, evolving, right from the mouth of someone who speaks with customers regularly and builds the product portfolio and understands how GRC is modernizing. But the first question is, what keeps you up at night?
I was in New York yesterday, and this mythos issue pops up, right? Everybody's freaking out about it, right?
Yep.
And if you think about the impact of artificial intelligence as a product owner, as a former founder, as somebody who loves the startup world, AI is super disruptive to a lot of industries, including ours, and how we approach the problem. And if I think about one thing that keeps me up at night is how are these technologies going to disrupt what we've known for 20, 30 years? And that may not be a bad thing, by the way, Christina. It's possible that this disruption is very positive for us, but as a startup in a quickly evolving space, artificial intelligence is very disruptive and therefore kind of keeps you up at night in a lot of respects.
It also is very potentially supportive. And I know that CyberSaint also has been working with AI, like others in the space. And so where do you think that AI can benefit GRC or CRQ, the cyber risk quant side of things? Where do you think it can be helpful?
If you think about back in the early days, we thought we could use self-assessment questionnaires and workflow to automate our way through compliance. And that's not true because we can't handle the scale of looking at vast systems. Software's only grown, right? I mean, Salesforce said it, software is going to eat the world, and it has, right? And so our approach to this for 20 plus years has been very, very slow to change and adopt and adapt. So one of the things that brought me to CyberSaint years ago was, one, the ability to leverage AI and some of the capabilities prior to generative and agentic, which we'll get into in a second, is how do we become more efficient in our programs? It's an efficiency play. How can we use real telemetry to automate compliance so that I don't have to send spreadsheets or questionnaires around to a massive amount of people, right? Very, very inefficient. We've done it. We've successfully done that. And we use these technologies now to streamline what clients need to do in order to get a better understanding of their compliance posture. But then we tied that data, leveraging artificial intelligence, to risk scenarios and how to do risk quant, right? So at the end of the day, we've leveraged these capabilities, even in the early days of artificial intelligence, natural language processing, graph neural nets. There's a lot of techniques. Everybody's, enamored with OpenAI and Claude and all these other things, but there's been these techniques around for years that we've been able to leverage in order to drive better efficiency so that whenever I get updated real-time telemetry, I can also understand the impact from a risk perspective and quantify that in terms that the executive team, the board understands, which is dollars, right? We've been playing around with risk models that have been qualitative. All the quant numbers that have been produced primarily in the industry have been just made up 0 to 100 range, 0 to 10, 0 to 1,000, name your range, it doesn't matter. Real risk quantification is boiling this down to a dollar impact because that's what boards and executives understand. So that's what we've done, right, with the platform, is been able to use these capabilities to automate compliance, tie it into risk quantification, and deliver a more comprehensive capability. That's before we even get into the Gen AI and all the agentic stuff that we've been doing lately.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. I mean, I've been in the industry now for 20 years, and I remember talking quite extensively about ML and graph neural networks and, Bayesian theory and all of these different things that predated modern AI. And so automating the ingestion and organization, or making efficient the data, as you said, was one of the early efforts. I feel that we're moving towards something called more operational intelligence. And it's the ability to combine those things together and to give, the board a sense, right?
We don't have a data problem in cybersecurity. We have a context problem. Why is the intelligence layer so important? Because we have to understand the context of the organization, their existing control environment, and their current risks that they care about. We've got great products out there in the industry, and I've worked for some of these companies over the years and helped take them public. They're great at one side of the equation or the other. So a new vulnerability comes in, Log5j comes out. Do I care? Depends. What's my environment? What's my control posture? Where are my critical assets and the risks associated with those? You can't answer that question from the vulnerability side alone. You have to be able to correlate this vulnerability is leveraging these techniques in the TTP chain. Here's the compensating mitigating controls. Do I have those in place? Do they tie to a set of risks I care about? What's that risk quant? And what's the potential impact of Log5j? And so you start to leverage these techniques to build this intelligence layer that allows you to look at any new vulnerability, any new threat, any new risk, Mythos, the one everybody's going after, and say, whoa, based off of my environment, here's what my potential risk is. And it's going to be very different organization to organization to organization.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And then, you start putting in things like the SEC change in 2023, where you're aiming the arrow at the back of the CISO, but also at the C-suite and the board. Then it becomes something that you need to understand, not just from, I accept that risk because I don't want to invest in remediating that risk. It's more like, I'm responsible for that risk. Let me understand where it might really impact the business. Is it then something we need to remediate or accept? And if we accept it, why? Because you have to be able to report all of that.
The materiality side of this is interesting, right? What I wish would have happened back then is we would have saw a corollary to Sarbanes-Oxley, where you have the CEO and the CFO sign off on the financials. What if you had a very similar regulation in cybersecurity where the CEO and the CISO had to sign off on your risk posture? Right?
What if?
It would change things overnight.
Well, this has been great. It's been a lovely chat, and we're really excited to have you on. And we appreciate you taking some time. We want to hear more about CyberSaint. And as I said, we look forward to a briefing and a demo. Yeah, we wish you all the best, and we're so grateful. So thanks again, Matt.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Matt. Bye-bye. Great. Well, I'm very pleased that the fabulous Fabio Campos can join us today as well for this special episode. And for those of you who don't know Fabio is the managing partner for global cyber strategy and risk leader at IBM. Welcome, Fabio. Thanks for joining us.
Rory, that's a pleasure being here today with you and Christina. And I would say it's more than a pleasure, it's a privilege. And I would say that I think there's a lot of good stuff for us to cover, not only in terms of what we've been doing or what we are, but where we're going.
Christina, just before we kick things off, just to say to listeners who've joined this during this part of the episode, we've already had a couple of great discussions about GRC, the history, where things have been and where we are now. And we had Matt on. It was really just to kind of include you in the conversation, Fabio, right, Christina?
Yes, and so here we are, Fabio, and I gave you a quick, let's review what Rory and I talked about and what Matt and Rory and I chatted about. And what we wanted to follow up on is, did we get it right? Number one, is the history and the evolution of GRC what you see? And then where are we today? And what is the art of the possible? And why is IBM, and I'm going to call out IBM because we've already said that IBM is a signal, why is IBM moving in this direction? What is to be gained?
Now, you've been looking at this for, I'm going to say, some time, and I personally, and we as IBM, value that perspective. So I believe what everything you described is totally aligned to what we believe and what I believe personally. I have always been in this industry or area in different ways and forms and different participation. But one thing that has not changed is there's all these other areas that become more, I'm going to say, important depending on the lenses that we look at from a security or cybersecurity point of view. And sometimes GRC or the EGRC now becomes an afterthought. So we have the ability today to really put together what I describe as the structuring of security with the doing security all together in one ecosystem. So, and that's where we want to take this forward in the industry, not only for IBM, but for, for the clients and the industry overall.
Wow. What is E in the EGRC, first of all? And then say more about the structuring, which I think is what we covered in our history and kind of evolutionary discussion. And then the doing, I'm equating to operationalizing. But let's back up to EGRC and then tell us more about the structuring versus doing.
Sure. The E comes from the enterprise,
Okay.
looking at the enterprise holistically. And
Got it.
sometimes I believe some of the industry or companies look at security from an isolation point of view, not in a whole of the company, and not only at the company itself, but their ecosystem they belong or they participate in, which kind of gets into the whole third-party organizations and the enterprise resilience that comes with that. In terms of what I simplified, I guess, or oversimplified in calling it structuring, is really putting forth what the requirements are, not only from a regulation point of view, but industry baselines, country specific, all the profiling that is needed for that company or group companies that determine what they're supposed to do. And that structuring sometimes get in the back burner of things because there's more imminent, more urgent things to be dealt with. And that is the portion I'm calling doing security, the protection, the monitoring, the response, the recovery, which is, that's the ER, right? The ER has to be fully equipped because there's no time to build a hospital. Right? Sometimes. So that is the combination I was alluding to in terms of structuring, building, and the doing part coming out together through data.
That is really, really helpful to our listeners. Thank you for that. So, we called out IBM as a signal. And what I was thinking, and I think Rory agrees, is that we were thinking that, this announcement that you've made looking at autonomous security, number one, taking the boring bits of the day-to-day, repetitive, continuous securing, it's a first step. So autonomous security, a first step using agents in that environment, which I think is fascinating, very futuristic. It's also very present. It is today, which, agents are moving so quickly. But anyway, I'll leave that aside. But that plus the assessment that you have around risk management, resilience, the GRC posture that you've announced, to us, it is signaling that we're moving from not just the static spreadsheets and consultant-led GRC, but that we're moving from all the different silos of GRC into a coordinated effort, number one, across the enterprise, to use your phrase, number two. So what is the future? If that's the case, and I think we're agreeing it is, if that's the case, what is the future in this space? What will be the art of the possible as we go forward, Fabio?
Christina, it's a wonderful question. And maybe the answer is going to be a combination of wish and hope with the actual things happening and then where we're going. So I'm referring to this present plus future, I guess, statement that I'm going to make, which is, I call it adaptive governance. So the agents will start actually moving. They are already moving so fast. And the things will be, when I say, what I mean by things is essentially the doing security part, will become so day-to-day autonomously oriented in terms of execution that if you look at the more GRC areas that take a little longer to kind of keep up with that execution, policy, process change, people doing things, and comes a little later. So in this new environment with the agents actually doing things, we need to very quickly adapt to the change that the agents will be performing. So we have to come up with this adaptive governance model that the agents on by themselves will do security and governance security in a very fast pace, almost I'm going to say near real time. And with that comes a lot of more, I'm gonna say, judgment and trust, which is kind of hard to use that word, right? So in the new
Yeah.
world, but the environment is going to become so volatile and changing so fast. There is no time for the C-suite, the executive governance, and the board members to really, wait for, of after the fact, so to speak, corporate governance applicability of their responsibility over the environment. So we have to kind of come up with something really quick for the C-suite also understand what's happening and take action, as much as the security itself in doing that security at the same time. So that adaptive governance is a glue, if I can call that, putting those two worlds together.
This leads right in, Rory, to our
Yeah.
probabilistic security conversation, doesn't it?
It does, absolutely. Fabio, we've been talking around this topic for a while. Looking at traditional determinism as an approach to security, to something that has to be a little bit more fuzzy when it comes to things, including this probabilistic.
It's a bit ephemeral. I think it's developing. I don't think we'll ever completely leave deterministic security, nor will we ever be 100% probabilistic, at least maybe not in my lifetime. But I think, Fabio, the way we're describing it is that we're accepting a certain amount of risk. We, the security practitioners, we, the enterprise, accepting a certain amount of risk in order to move faster, because we have to move at machine speed, to your point. We have to make decisions that are beyond human capability in that machine speed. And therefore, what does that do to the risk registry, right? It's no longer a static risk registry, and it has to be, again, to your point, it has to be adaptively governed.
No, it's spot on, Christina. And we're already seeing in the, I'm going to say, the operationalization of the agents coming together and working together. And for example, when we bring new data points at the speed of what's happening into these, I'm going to call ecosystem of agents, and there's a new vulnerability that was detected or some change in the asset of that the digital asset of that organization that changed the profiling, as soon as the agents start operating and working together, that risk positioning, the profile changes automatically. So essentially, there's no more time to say, I am the risk individual in that organization, that I have my risk profile, that risk register was done eventually at one point in time, could be yesterday, or last week or last month. And I'm going to update something, even though it could be automated. I need to update something, then go for another discussion level or decision making. So that time is gone. So this new positioning with the agents, literally, now we're seeing right now in real near time, that positioning, profiling, risk posture changes. So now the individuals have to adapt themselves to make some of those decisions. If they're not allowing the agents to make those decisions, they will have to, like the human in the loop component. But they have to be really into this and seeing this thing literally almost 24/7 to really keep up with the velocity of that change coming through.
Bye-bye.
Information is going to be there, and sometimes ignorance is a bliss. So I think that's going to disappear or reduce tremendously. So that's why that adaptive governance comes in and say, okay, based on my appetite, based on my environment, based on my profile, what I can and cannot accept, some of these things will be done more driven, if you will, from this process automated, intelligence driven. Some of those may not, but that changes. And that is specifically a historical way of looking at risk and dealing with it, making decisions off of that. It will be much faster. So it will be a big change in behavior and how companies will deal with that.
It sounds as if that's heavily automating to the point of which it would only slow things down, having a human doing the governance aspect. It sounds as if it's a change from governance after the fact to governance before the fact. In other words, it is possible to do that if processes and workflows are created beforehand such that you make them available for the agents to then act on, as opposed to doing so once the activity has taken place. Is that right? Because there's a point at which it's going to be impossible for a human operator to react to something. Therefore, as much as possible will have to be scenario planned for the agents to act on.
Absolutely. And the conversations we're having and the build that we're baking in right now focuses more on governing the governance. Maybe that's not the right terminology, but the model will be so autonomously capable of executing that automation that the job of that risk individual becomes more so governing and assessing the risk of the model performing the right things at the right time,
Yep.
rather than looking at the risk itself. Yeah.
Exactly. We've had lots of discussions about this on, who watches the watchers. If we have a situation where decisions need to be made and you're handing control of that to an autonomous group or individual, you need another layer on top to do that. And we talked with a number of companies at RSAC who have these kind of governing agents, who have this power to control the activities of agents that are given these autonomous duties. So they're kind of like a hierarchy. And if you assemble those governing agents that have perhaps control over a set of other agents, you can put something in place that will allow you to determine if your system is governing correctly, given the autonomy it has. I think it's just that kind of getting your head around that is tough at these days. Yeah, isn't it, Christina?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. We're having, as Rory said, a lot of conversations about that. We just published an interview with, I don't know if you know, Rock Lambros. He is over at Zenity, and he also has his own consulting firm, and he's been working with OWASP quite a bit on the top 10 agentic vulnerabilities, and then he's looking at systems for watching the watchers. And so take a look if you haven't seen that interview, or if I think this is great. I think we should put a pin in it here, Fabio, because we promised you we'd have you in and out of the studio as quickly as possible. And we wanted to bookend our conversation on the history, evolution, and then our chat with Matt, and then bring in you to kind of bookend and wrap it up. Any last thoughts that we need to take away and that our listeners should hear from you before we thank you for your time?
Christina, Rory, first, thank you for having me. Two, I think there's a lot more is going to happen in the coming weeks, I'm going to say, because a lot of this change happening in the past few weeks, that kind of really required a lot of our, I'm going to say, faster response to it. So that's going to require more and faster. And just close it with it, I think we're going to be seeing a major industry change in this GRC space. And I think GRC is going to become not less important, but embedded in the process in a way that becomes more seamlessly driven or dealt with. Has to be done by design, by default.
Beautiful. You are such a wonderful guest, and thank you so much for jumping on last minute and gracing us with your wonderful words of wisdom. And we will have you back, Fabio. We really appreciate your time. And for now, we'll say bye-bye, but yeah, please come back and visit us again.
Thank you, Fabio. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Well, those were some great conversations we had with Matt and Fabio. Always great to get the perspective of our guests, especially from those two on the topic of GRC, Christina.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Matt brings a lot of time in the startup world and in GRC, and so he had a great perspective from the startup land. And then Fabio, I just have to say he's the OG, at least as far as, for me in terms of going back many, many years knowing Fabio. And he brings the art of the possible and the future that he sees for GRC. So I loved both conversations. It was great to have them on.
Yeah, fantastic. So we hope you enjoyed this episode, our special episode on GRC. We will be doing other episodes like this coming up. We'll be doing one on threat hunting, which we're looking forward to doing, and other aspects of the industry. But in the meantime, if you would like to sign up for our newsletter, Signal Not Lies, you can do so through our website, which is richmondadvisorygroup.com.
Yeah, and so folks, if you'd also like to get in touch to give us your feedback, we are always open to hearing your feedback. You can email Rory at rory@richmondadvisorygroup.com. And you can email me at christina@richmondadvisorygroup.com.
Great. Thanks, Christina. And we look forward to you joining us next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.